Draw Someone Else's Life with H.P. Lovecraft. Commonly referred to as the father of modern horror, Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born in Providence, Rhode Island on August 20th, 1890. Marrying late in life, Lovecraft's father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, was an established traveling jewelry salesman, which left him mostly absent from young Lovecraft's life. When Lovecraft was 3, his father had developed a mental disorder brought on by untreated syphilis. Due to his disorder, Winfield Scott Lovecraft was committed to the Butler Hospital in 1893 and succumbed to his illness 5 years later. After his father's death, Lovecraft was raised by his mother, Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft, his 2 maiden aunts, Lillian Delora Phillips and Annie Emmeline Phillips, and also his grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, who, before his death in 1903, taught his grandson from a young age all he knew of the art of storytelling. Lovecraft was often described as a sickly child. After the loss of both his father and grandfather, Lovecraft's aunts and mother had begun spoiling him with a diet of candy and sweets, which contributed to his sickly appearance. Lovecraft also suffered from night terrors and a rare parasomnia, a condition that not only contributed to his appearance, but is also believed to have influenced his later works. Lovecraft spent his grade school years at home with his overprotective mother. It was during this time that Lovecraft became an avid reader, enjoying the works of Edgar Allan Poe, and taking serious interest in astronomy and ancient history. At 17, Lovecraft was allowed to attend Hope High School. Having no proficiency in math, Lovecraft had a mental breakdown after the realization that his math grades would keep him from his goal of becoming an astronomer. This breakdown kept Lovecraft from graduation, and not receiving his diploma became one of the biggest regrets of his life. After his ordeal, Lovecraft became a recluse, staying up late into the night to study and write, while sleeping during the day. During this time, he was able to publish some articles on astronomy in the Providence Tribune. Starting his own literary career as a journalist, Lovecraft was invited to join the United Amateur Press Association in 1914, and launched his own magazine, The Conservative, writing several essays and other pieces 1 year later. In 1917, Lovecraft began pouring his focus into his story writing, emulating his literary idols Lord Dunsany, an Irish fantasy writer, and Edgar Allan Poe. In 1919, having suffered from hysteria and depression since her husband's death, Lovecraft's mother was finally committed to the Butler Hospital for her well-being, but passed away 3 years later due to surgical complications. 1 year after his mother's death, the pulp science fiction horror magazine, Weird Tales, began to buy some of Lovecraft's work, giving him his first taste of success. Through his work with Weird Tales, Lovecraft met Sonia Green, a successful hat shop owner from Brooklyn, who was 7 years his senior. The two married in 1924 and moved into a small Brooklyn apartment together. Their marriage was troubled, however, when a bank failure caused Sonia to lose her business and assets. During that time, Lovecraft struggled to hold several low-paying jobs to support he and his wife. Sonia began traveling in search of work, leaving Lovecraft behind in Red Hook, Brooklyn. After a burglary left him with nothing, Lovecraft wrote The Horror at Red Hook, which reflected his growing distaste for New York. In the story, he says, "My coming to New York has been a mistake, for whereas I had looked for poignant wonder and inspiration, I had found instead only a sense of horror and oppression, which threatened to master, paralyze, and annihilate me." After divorcing Sonia, Lovecraft returned to Providence to live with his aunt. Lovecraft spent the final decade of his life hiking Providence and writing in the city's beautiful library, the Athenaeum. During this time, Lovecraft produced a majority of his more notable works, which followed themes of humanity's insignificance, which had been inspired by his unpleasant interactions in New York. These works included The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, later adapted to film as The Haunted Palace, starring Vincent Price, At the Mountains of Madness, which influenced several John Carpenter films, including The Thing and In the Mouth of Madness, and The Call of Cthulhu, the first entry in his Cthulhu mythos. Call of Cthulhu was published in Weird Tales in 1928, and was expanded upon through the Cthulhu mythos, a collection of stories depicted in the same creative universe which reflected Lovecraft's own philosophical ideals. When his aunt died, and his close friend Robert E. Howard, author of the Conan the Barbarian series, committed suicide, Lovecraft fell into a deep clinical depression. Lovecraft had lived frugally off his inheritance, sometimes going without food to afford the shipping costs of his letters. He steadily became destitute as his health declined, and on March 5th, 1937, after having just completed his novella The Shadow Out of Time, Lovecraft died of cancer at the age of 47. Two of his closest friends, August Derleth and Donald Wandry, formed the publishing company Arkham House to promote and preserve his works. Virtually unknown during his life, Lovecraft is now referred to as one of the most significant 20th century authors of the horror genre. He has been an inspiration for horror writers such as Peter Straub, Stephen King, and Neil Gaiman. King has been quoted as saying, "Now that time has given us some perspective on his work, I think it is beyond doubt that H.P. Lovecraft has yet to be surpassed as the 20th century's greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale." Thank you all for watching my short biography on H.P. Lovecraft.